Imagine sitting across from your fiancé while he calmly explains that before you can get married, he needs legal protection for the future inheritance rights of children who do not exist yet because one day they might need exclusive access to his rare video game skins. Not a house. Not a trust fund. Not grandma's diamond ring. Digital outfits. Pixel jackets. Glittering swords. Virtual nonsense with a resale market and the emotional weight of a royal bloodline. My friends, if that doesn't make you set your coffee down and whisper, "Absolutely not," then you are stronger than most of us. My friends, this is Scarlet Veil. And today, I'm telling you a story that feels like Gossip Girl got locked in a gaming chair with a family law attorney and a man who thinks his online inventory deserves a dynasty. Welcome to Lying Whispers. Grab a coffee or whatever you're drinking, and come with me through this absurd mess, because this one has everything: control, money, ego, wedding tension, a mother-in-law with opinions nobody ordered, and a fiancé who really said, with his whole chest, that his unborn children needed a prenup clause protecting legendary skins. So before we dive in, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments the weirdest reason you've ever seen a relationship spiral. Stay with me until the end, because this story starts with one awkward conversation and ends with a question that belongs on AITA and in a therapist's office. Was she wrong for thinking her fiancé had completely lost the plot? Or was this the reddest flag ever wrapped in gamer jargon and self-importance? The woman at the center of this story is going to be called Natalie. 28, smart, polished, funny in a dry, dangerous way, and the kind of person who always seemed calm even when she was mentally drafting a 6-page resignation letter from somebody else's nonsense. She worked in marketing, had her life mostly together, and believed she had done the impossible: found a man who was ambitious without being arrogant, successful without being performative, and nerdy in a way that felt charming instead of spiritually exhausting. That man was Brandon. Brandon was 31, worked in product design, made good money, wore expensive sneakers like he was trying not to care about them, and knew how to be appealing in all the ways that matter early on. He listened. He remembered details. He texted back. He laughed at Natalie's jokes without doing that thing some men do where they act shocked a woman can be funny, as if she just solved a Rubik's Cube with her eyelashes. For nearly 2 years, Brandon seemed like the kind of man you brag about softly, so you don't jinx it. They met through friends at a rooftop birthday party in Chicago, and from the beginning, the chemistry was easy. He liked that Natalie was quick. She liked that Brandon seemed steady. They built a relationship that looked almost suspiciously healthy from the outside. Weekend trips, good restaurants, shared playlists, mutual friends, talk of maybe getting a dog, talk of maybe someday having kids. It was the kind of relationship people pointed to and said, "See? It can still happen," which, in hindsight, should have been everyone's first mistake. Because Brandon had a hobby. Now, let me be fair. A hobby is not a crime. Adults are allowed to enjoy things. That is, in fact, one of the few surviving pleasures of paying taxes. Brandon loved gaming. Not casually, not a few matches after work, not "I still play with my college friends sometimes." No. Brandon had a deeply curated digital life. He collected rare skins, limited edition cosmetics, retired event items, exclusive weapon wraps, discontinued avatars, and all sorts of online game collectibles with names that sounded like rejected superhero titles. Natalie knew all of this. She didn't judge him for it either. She genuinely tried to be supportive. She would sit beside him sometimes while he explained why one knife skin mattered more than another. She nodded through conversations about scarcity, drop rates, discontinued servers, marketplace trends, and community value. She did what loving partners do when the person they care about is passionately describing something objectively ridiculous. She respected the feeling even if the subject itself looked like expensive nonsense in high definition. And in fairness, some of those items really were worth serious money. Brandon wasn't inventing that part. His account was apparently worth enough to make other collectors jealous. He talked about his inventory the way some people talk about vintage wine or first edition comics. It was a collection. It was a status symbol. It was an investment. It was part of his identity. Still manageable. Still harmless. Still, theoretically, not something that should one day threaten a wedding. Then Brandon proposed. It was beautiful, of course. Men are never more romantic than when disaster is waiting quietly behind a curtain. He proposed during a long weekend in New York, in a private little corner of a restaurant terrace with skyline views and candlelight, and just enough discreet wealth in the air to make it all feel cinematic. Natalie cried. Brandon cried. They called their families. Her friends screamed into the phone. His mother posted something vague and emotional online within 26 minutes. The usual. For a few weeks, they were blissfully normal. They talked about venues, timing, the guest list, whether they wanted a band or a DJ, where they might eventually buy a place, what kind of wedding felt like them. Natalie started collecting ideas. Brandon started making spreadsheets, which, at the time, felt useful. Then came the conversation. It was a Sunday afternoon. Natalie was on the couch half looking at wedding inspiration and half bricing floral arrangements, which is really just a pretty way of saying she was being emotionally mugged by peonies. Brandon was at the kitchen island with his laptop. He cleared his throat and said, very calmly, "Hey, we should probably talk about a prenup." Now, before anyone starts climbing onto a moral soapbox, a prenup itself is not the scandal here. Plenty of adults have rational conversations about protecting assets. Sometimes it's responsible. Sometimes it's smart. Sometimes it saves two people from becoming enemies in matching monogrammed bathrobes 5 years later. Natalie was not offended by the concept. In fact, she said exactly that. Sure, she told him. That makes sense. See? Mature. Reasonable. The door was wide open for civilized conversation. Brandon turned the laptop toward her and showed her a draft. At first, everything looked normal. Savings, retirement accounts, equity, premarital property, debt responsibility, business interests, inheritance language. Fine. Boring, but fine. Natalie skimmed and nodded in places. She even complimented him on being organized, which, unfortunately, only strengthened the monster. Then she saw a section titled Digital Assets and Transfer Rights. She paused. Brandon leaned back in his chair like a man about to unveil genius. That's the section about my gaming inventory, accounts, and rare skins. Natalie laughed. Not because she was trying to be cruel. She laughed because she genuinely thought he was joking. It was a soft, confused little laugh, the kind you do when reality suddenly puts on a fake mustache and asks if you're paying attention. Brandon did not laugh back. And that, my friends, is the moment this story left the highway and drove straight into the decorative fountain outside the venue. Natalie looked at him. You're serious? Yeah. You want your skins in the prenup? They're valuable. Okay, she said slowly. Valuable enough that you want legal language around them? Yes. Again, still weird, but not yet nuclear. If Brandon had simply wanted to clarify that those items remained his separate property, Natalie probably would have raised an eyebrow, texted 2 friends in disbelief, and moved on with her life. But Brandon was not done. Because Brandon had apparently been storing nonsense in a special vault until the exact moment it could do maximum damage. He tapped a second paragraph in that same section. I also want to set up future transfer protections for any children we may have. Silence. Not regular silence. The kind of silence where the air itself seems to turn and stare. Natalie blinked. For what? For the rare items, Brandon said. I want it clearly stated that certain skins and legacy inventory pieces are designated for our future kids. So there's no confusion later. Natalie actually looked behind her for a second, as though maybe a hidden camera crew was about to jump out and explain this was some kind of social experiment on female patients. Our future kids, she repeated. You mean children we do not currently have? Right. And you want the prenup to say that your rare skins belong to them? Eventually, yes. She put her phone down very carefully. Brandon, what are you talking about? He gave that maddening little exhale certain men do when they think they're the only person in the room being rational. It's estate planning, basically. Estate planning. For game skins. For unborn children. He said it with the serene confidence of a man explaining college savings. Natalie stared at him like she was watching her own engagement slide gently out of the frame. She tried once more to give him the benefit of the doubt. Why on earth does this need to be decided now? Because if we're doing a prenup, it makes sense to cover everything. No, she said. It makes sense to cover actual shared legal realities. This sounds like you're building a digital monarchy. Brandon frowned. It's not a monarchy. It's smart.
Of course he said that.
Men will build a fantasy kingdom in Excel and call it practical. Natalie asked the obvious question. Do you actually think I would try to take your skins? Brandon hesitated. There it was. That tiny hesitation. That microscopic pause that says more than a speech ever could. Not exactly, he said. Oh, not exactly. A classic. The appetizer to something worse. Then what exactly do you think is happening here? Natalie asked. Brandon folded his arms. I think digital assets are going to matter more and more. I've spent years building that collection. Some of those items have gone way up in value, and I don't want any future ambiguity, especially if we have kids. Natalie felt something shift, because now it wasn't really about the skins. It was about the energy underneath the conversation, the suspicion, the weird assumption that one day there would be ambiguity between them and that whatever happened, Brandon needed to establish in advance that his line of succession through future children could not be tampered with. This man was talking like a duke in a velvet jacket protecting the crown jewels of Call of Duty. She said, Do you hear yourself? I hear myself being realistic. I hear you planning a custody battle over cosmetics for children who aren't even theoretical yet. He looked annoyed. She looked stunned. And just like that, the room changed. What Natalie couldn't shake afterward was not the absurdity. Absurdity, strangely, can be survivable. Couples argue about stupid things all the time. The part that bothered her was the implication. Brandon was speaking as if he needed protection from her. As if marriage were a merger with a hostile takeover risk. As if one day she might use motherhood, family, or legal status to wedge open control over something he considered sacred. That is not how you talk when you view someone as your partner. That is how you talk when you already imagine them as a future problem. The conversation ended badly. Brandon insisted she was mocking something important to him. Natalie insisted he was turning their engagement into a bizarre pre-litigation seminar for imaginary heirs. Neither of them budged. He went for logic. She went for common sense. He called it planning. She called it deeply unsettling. Both went to bed angry, which really means neither one slept, and both rehearsed speeches in the dark. Over the next week, Brandon kept bringing it up. That, more than anything, is what turned one strange moment into a crisis. First, he sent Natalie links about the growing value of digital goods. Then, he forwarded an article about inheritance disputes involving online assets. Then he showed her discussion boards where collectors talked about protecting gaming inventories during divorce and estate transfer. He had evidence.
Charts.
Forum threads. Screenshots. This man had done homework for a class nobody asked him to take. At one point he even said, I'm not the only person thinking about this. That sentence has launched more terrible decisions than tequila. Natalie tried talking to him again, but every conversation got uglier. Brandon kept circling back to the same theme: value, risk, protection, future clarity. Natalie kept circling back to her trust, tone, timing, and why on God's green internet he was talking about unborn children like junior executors of a gaming estate. Then he made the mistake of mentioning it at dinner with friends. And honestly, some people do not need enemies because they are so committed to publicly embarrassing themselves. Natalie and Brandon were out with another couple, Lauren and Micah, at a little place in West Loop. The conversation was breezy, half about wedding planning and half about everyone's latest work complaints. Lauren asked if they'd settled anything major, and Brandon, with all the confidence of a man who had never once in his life heard himself correctly, grinned and said, We're sorting out a prenup, including my digital legacy. Lauren laughed. Micah laughed. Natalie did not laugh. Brandon kept going. He explained the skins, the values, the prenup section, the future children, the transfer language. Lauren stared at Natalie the way women do when they are trying to telepathically ask if they need to fake a medical emergency and get you out of there. Micah, bless his confused little soul, finally said, Wait, you mean like your future son gets the flaming sniper rap? Brandon nodded. Something like that, yeah. There was a pause so awkward, even the breadbasket seemed embarrassed. Lauren tried to rescue the moment with humor. That is the most 21st century sentence I've ever heard. But Natalie saw the flicker in Brandon's face. He didn't think it was funny. He thought they didn't understand his vision. And that, my friends, is always how a delusional person sees the room. Not as alarmed, as uneducated. After dinner, Natalie asked him why he had brought it up in front of other people. Brandon said he didn't see the big deal. Of course he didn't. He had moved past big deal territory. He was now living in a gated community called Principal. A few days later, Brandon's mother called Natalie. And just like that, the devil put on a cashmere cardigan. Her name, for our purposes, is Diane. Diane had the polished, chilled voice of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of sounding gracious while actively setting your furniture on fire. She told Natalie she had heard there was a little tension around the prenup. A little tension. Yes, because medieval succession law for cosmetic game inventory is such a tiny domestic wrinkle. Natalie stayed polite. Diane said Brandon had always been careful with what he built. She said he was more sentimental than people realize. She said men sometimes express security differently. Whenever someone says men just express security differently, prepare for emotional tax fraud. Then Diane delivered the line that really made Natalie sit up straight. You shouldn't take it personally, sweetheart. He just wants to make sure things stay in the family.
Stay in the family.
Excuse me? The family did not exist yet. There were no children. There was no dynasty. There was no crumbling digital castle on a hill requiring bloodline protection. There was only Brandon, his laptop, and a level of possessive delusion that should have come with a warning label. Natalie got off the phone and did what many women do when a situation starts sounding too absurd to trust their own instincts. She checked herself against reality. She called her older sister. She texted Lauren. She talked to a friend from work who'd been through a nasty divorce. She even asked a cousin who was really into gaming whether she was missing something. People gave different versions of the same answer. Yes, digital assets can be real assets. No, she was not crazy. Yes, something about Brandon's approach felt deeply off. No, the issue was not the existence of a valuable collection. The issue was that he seemed emotionally more committed to protecting it from her than to building a shared life with her. One friend put it beautifully.
A prenup isn't the problem, she said.
The problem is that he already talks like you're one bad season away from becoming his legal adversary.
Exactly.
Natalie decided to have one serious, direct conversation before doing anything dramatic. She invited Brandon over on a Thursday night. She made coffee because some women light candles before difficult talks, and some women choose caffeine as a weaponized support system. Natalie sat at the kitchen table and said everything clearly. She told him she respected the value of what he owned. She told him she understood separate property. She told him she was not offended by legal clarity. But she also told him that his obsession with this issue, the language he used, and the fact that he was already imagining scenarios where she'd interfere through future children made her feel distrusted, diminished, and strangely replaceable. Brandon listened. He even looked thoughtful for a second. Then he made the fatal error. You're making this way more emotional than it needs to be. Ladies and gentlemen, there it is. The little nuclear button hidden inside so many male arguments. The suggestion that the problem is not the insulting thing he said, but the fact that you had the audacity to have a nervous system about it. Natalie's face went still. More emotional than it needs to be? Yes, Brandon said. I'm talking about structure. You're turning it into an attack on our relationship. Because it is an attack on our relationship. No, it's not. You are literally asking me to sign a document that predicts I might one day use our children to get access to your gaming inventory. Brandon stood up from the table and started pacing, which, for the record, is never a great sign. Men pace when they think they look burdened and intellectual. Half the time, they just look like they're trying not to throw a tantrum in loafers. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? I'm saying I want protection. From who? He didn't answer fast enough. Natalie felt something cold settle into place. Finally, he said, from ambiguity. From future complications. From anyone trying to leverage family dynamics over assets that are clearly mine. There it was. Anyone. Not just a hypothetical future legal event. Not just a technical concern. Family dynamics. Leverage. Clearly mine. This man was not discussing paperwork anymore. He was revealing the architecture of his fear. Natalie asked quietly, "Do you think I'm the kind of person who would use our kids to manipulate you?" Brandon dragged a hand through his hair. "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said." "No, it's what you're hearing." And there it is again. The soft, polished little gaslight. The elegant version of "I didn't hurt you, you just bruised too visibly." Natalie didn't yell. That's what made it worse. She was too disappointed to yell. She just said, "I don't think you want a wife. I think you want a witness who signs off on your boundaries and never makes you feel vulnerable." Brandon stared at her like she'd slapped him with a tax form. The next few days were terrible. They barely spoke. When they did, it was clipped and brittle. Brandon sent long messages trying to explain himself. Natalie left most of them unanswered. Diane texted twice with faux concern. Lauren offered wine and arson. Micah, apparently now emotionally invested, wanted updates and kept sending Natalie meme-worthy questions like, "So are the kids at least getting equal shares of the dragon skin?" Honestly, bless him. If you've made it this far, support with a like, because this is where the story stops being "wow, that's weird" and becomes "oh, this man has been rehearsing mistrust in private." A few days later, Natalie accidentally found a shared planning folder Brandon had created months earlier for their future. Inside were spreadsheets for apartment budgeting, guest list drafts, honeymoon estimates, school district notes, projected savings goals, and one document titled Long-Term Asset Continuity. Now, nothing good has ever come from a file with that name. She opened it. There were tabs.
Tabs.
Real estate, retirement, personal valuables. And then one titled Digital Collection Legacy Transfer. My friends, if your fiancé has a legacy transfer tab for his game skins, the relationship is not in trouble. It has already become performance art. Natalie scrolled. Every major skin and collectible item was listed with notes. Estimated value, rarity, liquidity, transfer limitations, preferred future disposition. One column, and I swear this kind of phrasing should get a person launched directly into orbit, was labeled Bloodline Retention Priority. Bloodline Retention Priority. That sounds less like a man planning a marriage and more like a minor villain from a streaming drama who wears expensive sweaters while ruining Thanksgiving. Natalie kept reading. Some entries were marked retain under direct mail line if possible.
Pause.
Direct mail line? For skins? Sir, this is not medieval France. It is a gaming account.
Sit down.
Another note read, avoid future marital dilution through child-based access claims. Natalie went numb. Because now it was unmistakable. This was not one weird conversation. This was not a misunderstood joke. This was not even a temporary anxiety spiral. Brandon had an entire internal belief system around ownership, family, and defense. He had quietly built a worldview in which marriage was a possible threat vector and future children were already positioned as legal pressure points. She saw the whole thing clearly in one awful flash. This man was preparing to marry her while privately drafting strategies to protect himself from her. That was the end. Not emotionally all at once. Those endings are for movies. Real endings happen in stages. First comes confusion, then argument, then disappointment, then recognition. Natalie hit recognition that night like a wall. She called Brandon the next morning and asked him to meet her at a coffee shop. Public place.
Daytime.
Neutral ground. Nothing says your relationship is in medical distress like a 10 a.m. coffee shop breakup meeting where one person already knows the future and the other still thinks there's room for a strategic pivot. Brandon arrived looking tense and polished, like head dressed for negotiations. Natalie kept it simple. She told him she found the document. She told him that what hurt was not the value of the items, but the fact that he had been privately framing her as a future threat. She told him she could not marry someone who needed to protect himself from her before they had even built a life together. Brandon went pale first, then defensive. He said she was blowing it out of proportion. He said the spreadsheet was just planning. He said she was reading hostile intent into neutral language. He said everyone protects what matters to them. He said it didn't mean he didn't love her. Love her. Maybe he did. But love without trust is just attachment wearing better clothes. Natalie listened until he started talking about compromise. He said they could remove the transfer section. He said maybe the wording had been too aggressive. He said he could revise the document. He said he never thought she'd actually find the spreadsheet, which is such a remarkable thing to admit out loud. I almost admire it for its pure accidental honesty.
Never thought she'd find it.
So it had been hidden.
Of course it had.
Natalie looked at him and realized she was done. Not furious. Not wild.
Done.
She said, I can't marry someone who has already cast me as the future villain in his private paperwork. That line hit him harder than anything else had, because there it was. The truth in one sentence. He tried one last time. He said relationships required difficult conversations. He said she was willing to throw away something beautiful over a misunderstanding. He said she was being dramatic. And if I had $1 for every man who calls a woman dramatic right after she accurately identifies his character flaw, I'd have enough money to buy Brandon's whole stupid inventory and gift it to a preschooler. Natalie stood up. She said, I'm not ending this over skins. I'm ending it because you trust your collection more than you trust the person you asked to marry you. Then she left. The wedding was called off within the week. And, as always, the social fallout was its own theater production. Friends wanted details. Some family members pretended to be neutral while vibrating with curiosity. Diane reportedly told at least 3 people that Natalie couldn't handle an organized man, which is such a gorgeous mother-of-the-grim euphemism for my son brought feudal language to a modern relationship, and she declined the offer. Brandon told people there were compatibility issues around asset philosophy. Asset philosophy. You know what? I almost want that on a pillow. Natalie lost deposits. She cried in dressing rooms. She had to make humiliating phone calls to vendors. She had to answer the same terrible question over and over again. What happened? At first she gave vague answers. Later she got tired and told the truth in increasing levels of detail depending on who asked. The best version became he wanted a prenup clause for unborn children to inherit his rare game skins, and somehow made it sound like I was the unstable one. That usually ended the conversation nicely. Eventually, Natalie did what everyone does now when life becomes too bizarre to narrate alone. She posted the story online in an AITA-style forum, stripped of identifying details, just to see if the internet thought she had overreacted. The responses poured in. Some people, naturally, defended Brandon on the technicality. Digital assets matter. Online property is real. Collections can have value. Yes, yes, and yes.
Nobody was arguing with that.
The problem was never that the skins had value. The problem was the psychological architecture of the request. Most people saw it immediately. One comment said, he doesn't want a marriage. He wants an end-user licensing agreement with emotional access limitations. Another said, this isn't about gaming. This is about a man who's already preparing his defense against his own future family. And, my personal favorite, if he's talking about bloodline retention for a neon rifle wrap, cancel the venue and save yourself.
Poetry.
Time passed. Natalie grieved. Not just Brandon, but the version of her future she had already started wearing in her mind. That part hurts too, maybe more. The lost shape of a life. The furniture you almost picked. The names you almost considered. The version of yourself that believed this was safe. But then something quiet and important happened. She started feeling relief. Not all at once. Not loudly. But steadily. Relief that she found out before the wedding. Relief that she listened to the discomfort instead of rationalizing it to death. Relief that she didn't spend years trying to prove to a suspicious man that she wasn't the threat he had already decided a wife could become. That is not a marriage. That is an audition with legal footnotes. Months later, Natalie was doing better. Therapy helped. Friends helped. Time helped. Distance helped most of all. Lauren eventually introduced her to someone new, and Natalie took it slowly, because that is what emotionally intelligent adults do after escaping a relationship built on hidden terms and conditions. She learned not to translate rigidity into maturity, not to confuse control with competence, not to mistake elaborate planning for emotional safety. As for Brandon, the rumor mill suggested he was still single, still gaming, still discussing emerging digital asset frameworks, like a man trying very hard to sound like a think piece instead of a cautionary tale.
Which feels right.
Men like Brandon do not say, I sabotaged my engagement by distrusting the woman I loved. They say, we had different values. Technically true. Emotionally laughable. And that, my friends, is the whole mess. A woman thought she was planning a wedding. A man thought he was securing a dynasty. And somewhere between floral deposits and future baby names, a relationship collapsed under the weight of one very ugly truth. He was more prepared to defend his rare skins from his future wife than he was to trust her with his actual heart.
So now I need to know.
Was Natalie wrong to walk away? Would you have signed the prenup and just rolled your eyes? Would you have pushed for couples therapy? Would you have run the second a grown man said bloodline retention priority about a digital costume? And at what point does being financially careful stop looking responsible and start looking like a personality disorder with Wi-Fi?